Well, welcome to the webinar on boosting research impact, policy engagement for early career researchers. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on behalf of the Learned Society of Wales and of Academia Europaea. So the program for this event is that I'll give a short introduction, making some general points. And then we have three panelists who are listed here on this slide. I will introduce each of them when we come to their presentations. Just some practical remark. After the presentations, we will have a general discussion. So please put your questions into the Q&A box. Make the questions as concise as possible, because there's not really time to read a long essay at the point of the discussion. So make concise questions or comments, and we will take them up in the discussion. So just to say a few words about the organizations that are involved in this webinar. One is Academia Europaea, which is an European academy organized actually quite similarly to national academies like the Royal Society, for example. So individual members are elected on the basis of scientific or scholarly merit. Academia Europaea, unlike, for example, the Royal Society, actually deals with all sciences and scholarships. So humanists and science are all involved in that academy. It was founded in 1988 and is now quite a large academy with more than 5,000 members, including a large number of Nobel laureates. It operates through a network of hubs across Europe, so it's quite a distributed academy. And one of the main hubs that actually carries out a lot of Academia Europaea's activities is the hub at Cardiff University, from where this webinar is organized. The other main organization involved in this webinar is the Learned Society of Wales, and specifically the Learned Society of Wales Early Career Researchers Network. So the Learned Society of Wales, established in 2010, has more than 700 fellows, mostly from Wales, of course, but also various fellows who have connections with Wales in one way or the other, but are working in Europe or in the US, for example. And so the aim is here, we will hear more about that in one of the presentations, is to enable early career researchers to participate in policy making and policy advice. And we will hear a lot more detail about that in a moment. Now, just a few remarks in general about science advice and policy. We can divide it up in basically two branches. There is what we may call policy for science, which often is of most immediate interest to scientists for obvious reasons. It's about funding for science, the conditions under which science is carried out. And that is something that is ongoing always. And I just give one example that I was involved in quite a number of years ago, giving evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee for Education and Skills. And as it so happens, only last week, I was at a meeting in Copenhagen at the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, of which I'm a member, together with the Danish Science and Education Minister, where actually very many of the same issues about funding or distribution between free science applications and strategic research were discussed, and the whole question about how much a society should invest in research. So these things go on, and very often the same questions come up again and again in different countries. It's mostly national because in spite of the European funding, which of course is important, nevertheless, we should not forget that science funding in Europe is predominantly done through individual governments and individual charities. The other aspect, which probably is more in the center here, is science for policy. And here, Academia Europaea is closely involved in the so-called SAPEA mechanism, Science Advice for Policy, by European Academies, which is part of the general scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission. And this is a responsive mechanism, so questions arise from the Commission and the various directorates, and we in SAPEA produce so-called evidence review reports. You see some examples of that in the slide here. And these reports, which basically survey the factual evidence base in various areas, will then be subject to scientific opinion by scientific advisors directly appointed by the Commission, and will eventually influence policymaking. Again, we can discuss aspects of that later on. I would also just mention, to put into the general mix of background information, that of course we are in a situation now where a lot of things are changing very radically, not least through AI. And in this respect, maybe some of you will be interested in the webinar that we are conducting next Monday on AI and academic publishing. What does the future hold for authors, readers, and publishers? This is an area that, of course, impinges on almost everything, also to do with science advice. And I think we have some quite important speaker, including the chair of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, who will be with us on Monday. So I won't take up any more time just now, because we want to return to all these questions in more detail, and particularly have the input from our audience as to what you are particularly interested in. So be ready to put your questions into the Q&A box. It doesn't have to be specifically related to the presentations, but obviously that would be one way of thinking about it. But any question related to the general area of science advice are most welcome. So I will stop there, and I will stop screen sharing, and I will give the floor to Katherine Welch, who is the Deputy Director of Partnerships at University College London's Public Policy. So, Katherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ole. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to now try and share my slides for you all. So let's do that first. We had a practice, but you never know if it's going to continue to work. Yes. Why won't it let me do that? There we go. Okay. Ole, can you see just my presentation now? Is that, have you got, and not the notes before I get started?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Lovely. Okay. Hello, everybody, and great to be here with you today. As Ole introduced, my name is Katherine Welch. I'm Deputy Director of Partnerships at UCL Public Policy. For those who might not have heard of UCL Public Policy, we are a team of professional services staff based at UCL who support our research community across our full breadth of disciplines. And UCL is a multidisciplinary university with a huge range of disciplines, and we support their engagement with the policy ecosystem across the UK. We are primarily focused on local, regional and national policy within the UK context, and so that's what my presentation will refer to. I know other speakers are going to look at different contexts and different areas. But I thought today what I'd do is give you a bit of a taster of what I have learned over the past 7 years working with UCL Public Policy about sort of mechanisms and routes into policy engagement for those that might be new to it. My personal background, I'm a geologist by subject. I have worked in media, in business media, and then moved to UCL to work in policy engagement. I would consider my career as one of sort of a knowledge broker or a knowledge mobilizer, providing some of that support role between different communities. So, what is public policy? Ola's given us a bit of an introduction, but perhaps to get us started right at the beginning, I suppose really in a nutshell, policy is the process by which governments make decisions to respond to societal issues and to create real world impact. And what we would like to do is to inform policy with evidence. That's part of the policy making process. This diagram is complicated and so for a reason, and that what I'd like to try and show you is that policy making and the policy system is not a linear process. This is a fantastic diagram produced by Katherine, who's now at LHSTM, in which she's mapped the bodies and relationships involved in delivering a single policy outcome. And you will see, without even any names or departments or anything else listed, the sheer number of nodal points and of different interactions that take place within policy making. And evidence and expertise are required at every point within this process, which gives researchers like yourselves a huge amount of scope to engage across sort of the policy and the policy ecosystem. Crudely speaking, and forgive me, this slide is slightly out of date. You'll notice some of the names of these departments have changed in more recent times. But crudely speaking, key public policy stakeholders across the UK form into sort of 3 broad categories, we would say. There's local and regional government, for example, local authorities, regional bodies such as the GLA, who we in London work with very closely, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, for example. There's policy professionals in central government and parliament. I've lumped those 2 together because they operate at the national level. That might include government departments, Department of Health and Social Care, Treasury, DSIT, etc., etc., but also members of Parliament, their support staff, including the House of Commons libraries, House of Commons committees, and Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, and other parliamentary bodies such as all-party parliamentary groups, which I can come back to slightly later on. And the third group that we would traditionally engage with our academics would be sort of charities, societies, think tanks, NGOs, national academies, those groups that have policy teams, run policy focused activities, or also provide that interface between academia and policy. So that's who you might engage with. Why might you want to engage in policy? Well, there are a number of reasons. They tend to usually come down to impact. You want to create impact, policy wants to create impact, and you can help policy create better impact, we would hope, by providing it with the evidence base to be informed and sound. From a policy perspective, again, some of these are slightly old, but Mark Walpott, former UKI Chief Executive, makes the point about the requirement for reliable evidence to enable development of effective policy. From a funding perspective, again, from UKRI, funding investment is, again, delivered to meet policy requirements and to deliver impact. And so, you know, creating greater funding opportunities for yourself and your work by engaging with policy. And there are a number of professional benefits for you and for your institution. You can promote the value and usefulness of your own research, showcase yourself and your institution. You can understand how to make your research more impactful with a whole range of audiences, not just those individual policymakers. And you can build networks and, importantly, career opportunities, whether that's for promotion or for broadening your career prospects. Going forward, policy engagement provides you with a great many transferable skills, which can be useful in all sorts of scenarios. Okay, so we know who, roughly, we know why we might want to do it. How might you want to inform public policy? Again, this slide is quite purposefully complex. The idea is to show that there are myriad routes to policy engagement and that one type of activity has the potential to inform multiple parts of the policy system. For example, a blog or media article, the second point at the bottom there, you can see can reach out to a number of different parts of the policy infrastructure. In short, there's no right way, instruction manual, or recipe success for policy engagement. Our experience is that it can be opportunistic, it can be serendipitous, and it often comes down to meeting the right person at the right time. But there are ways that you can get started on your journey and useful resources that can help you find the opportunities to present your work. So please don't, if this is new to you, feel sort of a bit spooked perhaps by the complexity of this slide. I think the idea is that I'm trying to get across is that there are a number of different opportunities out there and a number of different routes in, and it's not a sort of a very linear process that you might expect to find with sort of traditional research, for example. So how to get started? In our experience, I think there are 4 sort of key activities or sort of mindsets to get yourself in to help you get started on your policy journey. The first, and for us, I think the most critical, is to build your networks. Join policy relevant groups, join networks within your institution and beyond. I'll come back to UPenn at the end of this presentation. The networks are really the place that you're going to start to engage with policy intermediaries such as myself, but also policy professionals themselves, and is really the first step to building those relationships to helping you get your own evidence into policy making. The second is to really be aware of policy priorities. It's all very well having your research ready to present, but if you're not meeting a policy need or a policy demand, you're probably unfortunately going to fall on deaf ears. So really it's important, if you want to engage in policy, to be keeping up to date with policy developments within your field and being live and aware to where those opportunities might be for your evidence to sort of underpin that policy making. The third is to be open and ready for opportunities. Again, joining not just networks, but mailing lists can provide you with regular updates of where opportunities might lie. The policy making process moves very quickly. It's a very different timescale to that of academia and of producing a piece of research and maybe a paper out of the other end of it. You need to be ready and you need to have your evidence there translated and ready to drop in when a policy opportunity occurs. So definitely be ready and open. And finally, broaden your dissemination beyond the traditional academic journal. It's really important, I think, to seek opportunities to inform policy in a number of different ways. In the UK context, particularly at the sort of national government and parliamentary level, those people don't have access to academic journals. They won't be subscribing behind paywalls. They won't be reading academic papers. They don't have the time or the availability of resource to do that. So the recommendation here would be to start to think about how you can start to translate your research and how you can start to get your evidence out there into policy relevant fora, for example, more traditional formal fora like select committee responses, but also things like blogs, writing LinkedIn posts, really connecting your research to the policy questions that are out there. Some do's and don'ts. So given all that, it's quite a lot. It'd be nice to try and distill it down into some bits that you maybe should and shouldn't do. I've got some do's and don'ts here that are sort of high level ideas to keep in mind of the way to engage with policy. The sort of standard do's: think about your audience in the policy context, be concise and focus on your findings. Like I say, academic papers are not something that policy professionals are going to have the inclination to read, I'm afraid. Be engaging and open to questions and future engagement, and be prepared for an iterative process. If we go back to that slide with all the different lines of different ways to engage, policy making and policy engagement is not a linear process. It's not a, you can provide your evidence and then it goes into policy. You're going to have to iterate that with multiple people and over multiple periods and through different routes. So be prepared for that. And some of the don'ts. Don't wait until the end of your project to engage. Engage with policy right through the project lifecycle and right through the policy lifecycle. And that's the way you're going to get the most buy-in and the most engagement. Don't use academic jargon. It goes along with being concise and being engaging. Don't get bogged down in methodology. Again, policymakers will be interested in the results. What does your evidence mean for their policy? Please don't send in academic papers and theses, and don't expect to see immediate impact. Again, policy processing and policy engagement is an iterative process, and it can sometimes be some time before you can sort of make a link between your evidence and a policy development. I put an asterisk there because these do's and don'ts come with a caveat. Like I've said, that policy engagement isn't straightforward. And I think if you'd like to interrogate some of these ideas a little bit further, I'd direct you to the paper by Katherine Oliver and Paul Kearney, which really starts to do a systematic review of some of the advice that people like myself and others give on academic policy engagement, and starts to run you through some of the complexity of the process. It's definitely well worth a read and a follow-up if you're interested in the general approach more broadly. To help you get on your way, so we've got the who, we've got the why, we've got a little bit of the how. Where might you want to begin? It's a bit of a daunting process. I think slides will be shared, but if not, I'll definitely make sure this one is shared with people. Here's some suggestions of a few places that you can approach to start your policy engagement process. The list here on the left-hand side are sort of the policy areas, the policy side of the window, and on the right are the research infrastructure side of the picture. An ARI database is a searchable list of areas of research interest which are produced by all government departments at the UK national government level. They're produced by the Chief Scientific Advisor's offices, the CSA office. There is now this searchable database in which you can identify across all departments where key terms are turning up in those areas of interest that are government priorities. The Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, I've mentioned briefly, is a service for parliamentarians and parliamentary staff. They produce a very useful newsletter, which offers opportunities for engagement, including for writing into select committee inquiries. All-party parliamentary groups are another way of engaging with parliamentarians across both houses and both sides of the house, and cover a wide range of interesting topics. I liken them a lot to university clubs and societies. There are some that are more formal, and there are some that are a bit more jovial. And Overton is an excellent resource. It's a searchable index of policy documents, guidelines and publications. Again, you can search for topics of interest, but you can also search for perhaps where your institution has been engaged and has been mentioned, and similar. Very quickly on the research side, UPenn I have a slide on in a second, which is a UK-wide network for academic policy engagement. UKRI, the UK funding body, I've got one more, Ole, I'm almost there, provides training and also fellowship opportunities for engaging with policy, so it's worth investigating. CAPE is a research project which has produced a number of resources on policy engagement, and UCL is part of. You can access those also through UCL policy. And the Royal Society has a science policy forum, again, a forum for networking on policy engagement. Very, very briefly, UPenn, if you do one thing at the end of this session and you're in the UK and interested in UK policy engagement, I urge you to sign up to UPenn. It's a national network of more than 100 universities dedicated to academic policy engagement, and provides you with resources, networking and opportunities that I think would help you get started on your policy journey. Ole, I apologize if I ran over, but that's the end there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Katherine. We have one question from Alexander Gilder, who says, Katherine, given the broadening of outputs in REF 2029, do you think we are going to see a bit of a boom in academics authoring policy reports and the like, with universities hosting these types of documents more frequently?
I would hope so. I think that we had a proportion of case studies submitted to the previous ref had strong policy engagement. I would anticipate that that would increase as a measure of impact and as sort of as impact case studies. I would urge to avoid policy reports and be policy engaged. I think if you're starting to think ahead to ref, think about how you can engage policymakers right from the outset of your project or your activity. And I think that will provide the greatest impact and tell potentially the better story for policy impact as part of your impact statement, rather than production of a policy briefing that has the risk of sitting on a shelf and not really being quite as well utilized.
Okay, thank you. And there's a second, and that will be the last question we can deal with now, from Lindsay Williams. Are there specific routes to engage with devolved governments in the UK?
Yes, there are. Again, we at UCL Public Policy, that's not an area that we deal with a lot. We tend to deal with UK national government and Whitehall and Westminster, being as we're in London and they're on our doorstep. My recommendation would be to go directly to those government websites. The infrastructures will be very similar to those of the Westminster government. They will have mechanisms for engagement, such as responding to inquiries, writing in, attending events, etc. I think if you go directly to those government websites, you'll find routes in through that.
Yeah, I think we may also come back to that question again a bit later in the discussion. Thank you very much indeed, Katherine.
Thank you.
Forward Dr. Jack Price, who is a research associate at the Wales Centre for Public Policy. So, Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen, which I hope you can all see. So my name is Jack Price. I'm a research associate at the Wales Centre for Public Policy. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about engaging with policymakers in Wales based on the experience that we've had as a centre over the past 10 years. So I'll say a little bit about who we are and what we do. Then I'll talk about some of the ways we've worked with policymakers in Wales and how that involves engaging with expertise, such as all of you on this call will have. And then finally, I'll share some reflections on what successful engagement looks like and some lessons that we've learnt over our time doing this. So who are the WCPP? We help policymakers in Wales to connect with and use the best available evidence to help them tackle their policy challenges. We're funded by the Welsh Government, ESRC and Cardiff University to work with Welsh Government officials and the wider Welsh Public Service. And you might know that in Wales, the Welsh Government is responsible for a large amount of government business, including frontline services like health, education and social care. Our organisational remit covers all devolved areas, and over the years, we've worked on almost all of them. We're hosted by Cardiff University's Business School, and we're part of the UK government's What Works network, which is a sort of grouping of organisations interested in bringing evidence to bear on policy decisions, and we're also part of the ESRC-funded International Public Policy Observatory. Our way of working is predominantly via knowledge mobilisation. That means that we bring together existing research and expertise in a particular area and present it in accessible ways framed towards the policy problem that we've been asked to tackle. Normally, we don't undertake primary research ourselves. So as we are a generalist centre working across a range of devolved areas, over the years we have published on a range of outputs. I'm sort of clicking through some recent and recent-ish examples of the things that we've worked on, all of which are, of course, available on our website. Our impact on Welsh policy making has been substantial in a number of policy areas. This quotation from the former First Minister of Wales shows our role in advocating and using evidence is seen as a valuable one within government. So, how do we work? So the next couple of slides are going to run through our normal project process and what that entails. This slide is more about our practice as a whole, and then the next one I'll sort of drill down into what that means in terms of working with policymakers and with experts such as yourselves. Firstly, we identify evidence needs. That means that we work with policymakers, officials and ministers to find questions that they need answering and gaps that they've already identified in their knowledge. We can then identify the expertise to help tackle that issue and work with them to mobilise the evidence. Secondly, we convene the evidence and expertise. That means bringing policymakers together with experts, sometimes through evidence synthesis or making evidence accessible to the people who make policy decisions, sometimes through round tables or events, but in all instances, turning that knowledge to an accessible and useful output framed within the Welsh policy context. Thirdly, we look to advance the understanding of evidence and policy among policymakers, but also among the broader academic community. We have an academic research team who have looked in the past at how evidence has been used to inform policy decisions and practice, and more recently looking at how our work in particular has gained impact and traction within the government and public service bodies that we've worked with. Fourth, we communicate our evidence. Everything that we do has a published output at the end, which is freely available on our website and is disseminated through social media and other channels. We also hold events, roundtables, other public-facing things to disseminate and discuss our findings in the broader policy context. We aim our work at a broad and non-specialist audience, and so we try to ensure that it is accessible and usable by a range of actors. And then the final thing that we do is advocate for and build the capacity to use evidence. So we encourage policymakers and practitioners to use evidence in their decision-making and offer them support to do so. We also help to build policy engagement within the academic community through things like hosting PhD internships, and we have a research apprentice program for budding researchers at a sort of pre-doctoral level. How that works with policymakers differs slightly based on who our client is. We have a direct commissioning relationship with the Welsh Government, which lets them ask us to look at particular policy areas or priorities. And we also have a self-generated work stream, which is funded by the ESRC, which is designed around the priorities and needs of the broader public service in Wales. How our process works when we have a project or policy area to look at is firstly, we will discuss scope, refine research questions for a particular project or policy area in conversation with all the relevant parties, including academic experts and government officials. The aim is to agree a project scope which is reasonable, asks the right questions for the policy challenge, and has evidence available to answer the question, which isn't always the case. The next step is to undertake the research. So we tend to do a mixture of work that we commission out from subject matter experts and work that we carry out on our own in-house. But whichever route we go down, we work closely with experts and policymakers to ensure our outputs are accurate, reliable, accessible and useful within the Welsh context, which is always our main priority. And then finally, we share our findings with policymakers and the broader public. This is often through a roundtable event or another public-facing event, as I mentioned before. Now, we normally consult a range of experts on our projects to gather views, to ensure that we're capturing the widest possible range of research and expert opinion, and we offer useful and practically minded findings to Welsh Government. At early stages, we rely on experts to help us refine research questions and key challenges within policy areas. In the research phase, we draw on expertise to help prepare and peer review our outputs. And then in the dissemination phase, we like to draw on a range of opinion again to ensure that our work is informed by a variety of different perspectives and to test our findings. Okay, so this is perhaps the bit of the presentation that you've been waiting for. How can you get involved with the work that we do or with broader policy engagement? These are some general reflections that are based off my own experience and that of others within the centre. A lot of them do echo what Katherine just said, so hopefully there is something in them. Firstly, government in the UK is serious about accessing and using evidence. This includes the UK government as well as devolved administrations, city regions, local authorities and others. Perhaps not parish councils, but I don't know, maybe. There's normally opportunities to get involved with that process if you look, whether that's through responding to consultations, talking with policymakers at events or fora, bidding competitively for research tenders. There are opportunities out there, and do get involved with them as and when they're relevant. One reason that policymakers do look for reliable evidence is that the civil service in this country is not generally made up of subject matter experts. There are some, but in the whole, we have a generalist civil service who are not necessarily specific experts in their domain. This means, firstly, that they want evidence, that's the good news, but secondly, that you need to present your evidence to them in a clear, precise, and concise way. Don't use academic language if you can avoid it, or spend too much time bogged down in the details. The methodology you use, for instance, should not be the first thing that you talk about. If your work has a suggestion that a particular area needs focus, there's value in looking to tackle a particular problem, that should be the first thing you say. What I like to describe this to people as is that you need to think like a journalist. You need to lead with the lead. Key messages come first, detail can be filled in later. Now, related to that, policymakers are looking for clear lessons and findings and a policy hook that's relevant to the work that they're doing. Give it to them. If your work links in with existing policy priorities or areas where there will or should be developments in the future, that's great. Make sure that they know about it. It can sound a bit obtuse to say, but policymakers and officials are time-pressed people. And if something is spelled out for them straightforwardly, it's more likely they'll engage with you. But don't expect an immediate return on your investment. Policy making is a slow process. As Katherine said, it's iterative. And it isn't always clear how your contributions are informing what's going on. Don't be disheartened by this. Sometimes you'll find your contribution informing something a while down the line, or in an area you didn't anticipate. In our own work, a project that we did on just transitions, we published and released, and we felt we had got nowhere with it. We had no sort of traction or pickup at all. But a year or two down the line, we found out that actually this had been a significant influence on Welsh Government thinking about this area. So sometimes things take a little while to bear fruit. So keep going. We know from the work that we do that policymakers value academic expertise. So keep looking for the opportunities to engage, and you'll find an open door waiting for you. We at the WCPP, in particular, are always happy to hear about relevant expertise to connect with policy in Wales. Okay, so thank you very much. That's all from me. I look forward to any questions that you might have now or later on.
Thank you very much, Jack, for this presentation. We do have one question from Charlie Ingram, who asks, could you provide an example of an engaging policy hook?
So, some example from work that we've done recently. We've commissioned out an evidence review into a policy area looking at free school meals and the provision of that and the benefits of it. What we received, and indeed it's what we asked for, was an academic evidence review looking at what the evidence says about it. But that concluded with a straightforward summary of what the research showed, which is great and useful. But if I was a policymaker, and we know this because they told us, what you want from that is a clear set of suggestions, recommendations, findings connected with the context in Wales. So you may know that in Wales, we're currently rolling out universal free school meals to primary aged children. There's the hook. So what does it mean when you say that the success of a free school meal programme depends on the nutritional content of the food? You connect that with policy developments that are going on. So you say, look, we know that you're reviewing the nutritional standards. So did you know that if you're also rolling out free school meals, this is a good way to maximise the benefit of that policy? It's about really drawing those lines between the academic side of the research, which provides the evidence, and then the context of that. So working with the government priorities, the programme for government, the Welsh government publish a programme for government every 5 years after an election. The other governments will have similar sets of priorities. And drawing those lines so that officials know this evidence isn't just interesting, good academic research, it's also directly relevant to this policy area or that policy area.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to move on. So we have had the UK perspective from Katherine, we had the Welsh perspective now from Jack, and now we are moving to the European perspective with Stephany Mazon, who is the Science Policy Officer with the Young Academies Science Advice Structure, also known as YASAS. So Stephany, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will introduce myself briefly in that I'm Stephany Mazon, as Oli already mentioned, but I'm an early career professional. I graduated from my PhD less than 5 years ago, around 4.5 years ago, from the physics department. And now I'm involved in the science advice mechanism. So I will also be sharing some personal experience of at least what worked for me, and I would very truly share that experience with you, so if it's useful for you. But before that, I'll run you through what YASAS does. The SAPEA project was already presented to you, but nonetheless, I will contextualize what YASAS does in SAPEA. So the Young Academy Science Advice Structure is a new network that unites the young academies in Europe. And what that does is it is offering a platform for the young academies, but also early careers in science for policy, specifically in the context of science for policy. So the European academies already have, the young academies already have the European Network for Young Academies, or the ENIA. So they already gather yearly to discuss all kinds of topics. But YASAS was made by the young academies for the young academies in science for policy. So that's what is different and what is special about YASAS. And once YASAS was formed by these 14 young academies that founded YASAS, is that it allowed SAPEA to invite them as decision makers in SAPEA. So there is now one board member in the SAPEA board that is from the young academies. And that's really important because now YASAS is able to also contribute to the development of SAPEA. And as Ole presented in the beginning, SAPEA is part of the science advice mechanism to the European Commission. And what is also particular about the SAM is that in this case, it is the policymakers, so the European Commission, who are requesting evidence advice by a question that they have. So they are already very much paying attention to the evidence that we'll be presenting. And that's why it's really important that young academies and the early careers are involved in this process, because there's a direct link to the European Commission and to the recommendations that come through the advisors of the SAM unit in this process. So this is what I would like to emphasize that is special about the SAM, and it's really wonderful to be part of SAPEA because of this. Now, YASAS, in the context of SAPEA again, it's leading the work that SAPEA is doing in engaging more early and mid-career researchers. So I know this is a seminar for early careers, but we also work with mid-careers, and I'll go a little bit into the definition in a minute. But what we're trying to do, and this work is again led by YASAS, is we've developed a strategy so that SAPEA can better engage with these early and mid-career researchers. And we're working currently on a report that will present what are the hurdles or the challenges and what are the incentives to include more early and mid-career researchers in science for policy activities in general. And for that, we've developed a survey, which some of you have contributed to, and I thank you for that. We have over 800 answers, so I'm really grateful for that. And we'll be sharing that report publicly with you at the end of the year, hopefully around summer. I'll be presenting just, I'll give you a trailer of two graphs from that report in a minute, so we can discuss that in the discussion section. But what YASAS is also trying to do is it's working with the young academies, but it's also working to strengthen the network of early careers in general. So that's something I think very relevant to you, because perhaps not all of you would be interested in joining a young academy, but nonetheless, we're really working to expand the network. So it would be wonderful if YASAS then establishes collaboration with other associations that are networks of early careers. For example, the Marie Curie Alumni Association is a wonderful example of a European level, but welcoming international, of course, fellows to its program across disciplines of excellent scientists who are so active in doing things beyond their academic work. The International Science Council, for example, also has a forum of early careers, and we're discussing with them as well how we can collaborate. So definitely, YASAS is really trying to strengthen the platform and the opportunities in Europe for early careers in science for policy. So that's the context in SAPEA and YASAS itself. So just to give you that overview, we have 14 young academies that founded YASAS in 2020. It's a very young network. We joined SAPEA in 2022, and we keep growing. So right now we have 19 young academies, and we are in discussions with other academies to join. And what's really exciting is that young academies are still being formed. So that's another exciting thing, and that we also hope to support young academies joining the network and forming. But now I'd like to focus, before moving to early careers in general, the young academies, why it's so important, again, that they're part of SAPEA. And it's because when we think about who are the people, who are the scientists that have already access to providing science advice, it's important to include the early career researchers, not only because we need a diversity in career stage, but because what early careers bring to the table already by themselves, almost by default. And that's, if you really look at the young academies, they are really, they have this really wonderful energy of being very inclusive, very innovative, very, they have a very exciting energy of wanting to do things. And so you have some of their staff members, for example, are actual researchers that are volunteering their time to make the Young Academy work. So that alone tells you that you have this commitment of excellent science, but they're also committed to having science for impact. And that's very evident when you look at the Young Academies. If you look at their website, and I've had the chance to talk to our Young Academies in video calls and face-to-face, and it's wonderful and really motivational to listen to this group of Young Academy members. So what is, again, particular about Young Academies, though, is that they have a shorter membership. So when you have a senior academy, you have a life membership. But Young Academies, by definition, because they're young, you only have a limited amount of time. So usually these are 5 years. And as I mentioned, their staff sometimes is the scholars themselves who are contributing their time to the functioning of these Young Academies. But what is really exemplary, as I've tried to really that you know more about this is that they are really champions in transdisciplinary, in collaboration, in equality, diversity, and inclusion topics. So when you look at their members, some of the young academies ask their members to work together in projects that by default will be transdisciplinary when other members are coming from different fields. And this is something so important when you're trying to think of providing science advice. If you're able to contextualize your science already in a way that is including more than just your science and provide a more complete picture to a policymaker in how this evidence is going to help them, that already works so much well. So for example, when we had the pandemic, of course, we needed virologists, but then we also realized we needed the economists and the psychologists and so on to help us understand how the situation was affecting us, and to provide evidence in order for governments to make decisions. So this is why transdisciplinarity is so important, and to be able to have the skills to work transdisciplinary is absolutely an essential skill. Another thing is they're really collaborative. So young academies really are bringing great scientists across Europe, and they're working together. They really want to cross-pollinate each other. So they want to share good practices amongst each other, as you can see already from the network where they meet every year. And this is another great practice of being able to work internationally to support each other. And again, if we have better networks of scientists working together, we'll have a stronger voice when we're trying to bring policy advice or recommendations. And then finally, something I really want to highlight again is this EDI, so this equality, diversity, and inclusion, or inclusivity and equity, and all this type of words such as social justice and being ambassadors of voices that are not heard. And that's something that you can also see, for example, with the UK Young Academy, one of the youngest academies that we have, and one of the latest YASA's academy to join. If you see that part of their strategy is specifically to give voice to these voices that are not necessarily heard. And that's so important, again, in making sure that the evidence that we're providing for policy is inclusive, because it is not just about a scientist giving advice, but it's about an inclusive community of scientists giving advice. This is so important, and this is something that the young academies are really working for, and are examples that are wonderful for me to be working with. And then a final comment here with the young academies is that they're also being quite innovative in the way that we are talking about who are the researchers providing the evidence. So they have also early career professionals, early career innovators, and they are considering these as other potential members that are qualified to give to be in the discussion of who's providing evidence. So this is something we can discuss more later on as well. Now, the Cardiff University was supporting SAPEA in creating a literature review to understand what the hurdles are for early careers. And not surprisingly, here are the top 6 things that came out. And the bottom ones are something that we added in addition to the strategy. But basically is the research practices that we have, and how we, the research culture that we have, in how is our research assessed, what kind of career expectations do you have? And when you're really, as an early career, trying to make sure that you're finishing your PhD, that you're getting the funding for your postdoc, that you are publishing your reports, all of that there's so much load that you have, that doing anything that comes out of that is really it's not a burden for the people doing it, because I'm sure you all want to do it, as I did myself, but it's still a load. So this has to be this has to be taken care of at an institutional level to reward this type of activities as well. So that would be in the evaluation aspect. And also when it comes to skills development, just by the fact that in Europe we have around 2 million researchers, but only a third of them will end up in academia, right? So the rest are changing careers into industry or going into policy, and we need to be aware of the type of skills that we are developing as an early career. Okay, I'm running out of time here. and also which will be helpful for you as science for policy, but also if you want to change your career into being perhaps a knowledge broker. So I will go more into the discussion, but I would like to ask if you have any forms that you would like to have in recognition of the activities that you're doing in Science for Policy, please put them in the chat. So other than certificate of participation, if you can think of anything else, please share that with us, because I'd like to be able to integrate that in our work that we do in YASAS and SAPEA. But very briefly, okay, this was just a discussion on who is an early career, but in SAPEA, we consider early careers as anybody that is within 7 years of your PhD graduation or your latest degree. And this is from the survey, and this is just self-identified career stages, and we can actually see that the early careers there in blue are quite falling within the 7 years. So that fits. But as another, as a quick.
Please, we have to finish very soon, Stephany.
Okay, so I'm just going to go and jump into this part, which is from the survey, the top 3 ranked reasons of how you could engage better in Science for Policy is that people wanted to have a better job security, have more credits for the work that they are doing, and access to training. And this is something that has already been, it's such an important discussion, for example, with the COARA, with the research assessment reform that's happening in Europe, which is how can we incentivize and also support and give credits to this type of activities that are outside of the academic realm, and that are also equally important. I'd like to share also one tool that you can go to. This is part of the European Commission that has done this framework for skills. And if you can just Google the competencies framework for Science for Policy, they will just give you an overview of competencies that would be useful for you to have in engaging in Science for Policy. And if you actually go through a survey that they have there, you will be able to see which are your competencies or skills already, which ones may not be that strong that you have, but they will also give you resources so that you can actually go and improve them if you want to, and read more about them. So this is something that's really perhaps relevant for you. It's something that I've also been trying to identify if you work with SAPEA activities, how these skills could be coming out. And actually, I think you might actually have more skills than you may realize when you start to list. Actually, I have some communication skills. I have some great group dynamic skills. And this is really important to be aware that sometimes we think as researchers, we don't have as many skills outside academia as we do, but we do. So do be, we have to be aware that we can contribute more than we think we can. So this was just the final questions I'd like to leave for discussion, which is how can we offer you better career development? Or if you're looking for a career change, how can we help you with that?
Okay, thank you very much, Stephany. We will now go into the general discussion. So if you can stop sharing your screen, then we can see each other better that way. So it seems to me, just to get started on the general discussion, that a good option in practice for engaging is to join some of the organizations that have been mentioned here. I mean, Stephany has, of course, mentioned the point that you can try to get into one of the young academies, and that seems to be a good way. It seems somehow rather difficult for an individual to think that an individual can, by himself or herself, have an impact. And I mean, you cannot, as an individual scientist, write a letter to a minister and suggest various things. Well, you could write, of course, but the chance of making an impact that way is pretty low. So it would appear that a good route to get started actually is somehow to get in touch with an organization that is embedded into the mechanisms that exist, because that's really almost, it seems to me, the only way in which one can actually get involved. One has to be opportunistic, that's very clear from what is said. A lot of people work in areas where there is no particular contemporary policy interest, but that can suddenly change. And that's why the sort of general advice, which many of you have mentioned already, namely that we need to be alert to what is happening in the policy world, because it may be that an area that has not actually been very important as seen from policymakers' point of view, suddenly through some change, suddenly becomes pretty important. One sort of, just to be a little bit controversial, it's sort of emphasized, I think, both by Jack and Katherine, that policymakers are not interested in the academic publications, which most certainly is true. However, I would like to stress that ultimately, as scientists, our authority, if we have any authority, obviously rests on the scientific work, which again means that ultimately it rests in practice on publications. And this is, of course, why whenever you read in one of the quality newspapers about some new developments, you will always see that they will mention this was published in Nature or Science or in PNAS or some journals. And this is because it is necessary somehow to emphasize that there is some kind of authority behind it. Anyone can, of course, pronounce an opinion, but if it is not based on something that has been sort of through careful and competitive evaluation, most people will not necessarily take it very seriously. So there's a kind of delicate balancing act. Obviously, policymakers are not interested in all the details, but they do need to know that an opinion is expressed on the basis of some actual knowledge that actually has been reviewed and has been accepted by a body that has some kind of authority. So maybe some of you could just sort of comment on that, because sometimes it can sound as if all we need to do is just express an opinion and we shouldn't go in any details because people are not interested in the detail. But there are some dangers, I think, in pushing that too much. Katherine?
Yes. Firstly, on your point about not being able to make an impact as an individual, I wouldn't completely agree with that. I think you can make an impact as an individual. One route in is to write to your MP. Everybody within the UK has a member of parliament representing them as a constituent, and that is certainly a route in. But you're right, individual voices don't carry the same weight as that of larger networks of institutional voices as well. So I would use those opportunities to amplify your work and amplify your voice where you can. And yes, the weight of your research is its rigor, is its impartiality, and is its credential as being that of genuine academic scholarship, and one that's been through the rigorous academic program. And I think that's what adds weight to your evidence in a policy context, where you have to consider that for any particular policy issue, that policymaker is not just going to be receiving your work. They're receiving information from a huge variety of sources, much of which will be opinion and conjecture, and much of it will be from a range of, straying right through into sort of lobbying, from a range of different sources. And they're not necessarily, as Jack sort of said, equipped with either the ability or the time to decipher some of that. So being able to lean into the impartiality, the rigor, the academic process behind your evidence will add weight to its validity. But again, as Jack said, the analogy of writing for media, of being a journalist, and my own background before going back into university is in media and journalism, and the crossover is very direct in that you want to lead with that hook and with that policy relevance of the impact of your work before going into the detail, either further down the page or at a later date of the sort of true evidence base behind it. But definitely lead with the hook, but make it evidence based. As a researcher, you're there to provide fact, perhaps, rather than opinion. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Jack wants to make a point.
Yeah, thanks. And I completely agree with everything that Katherine was saying. I think absolutely, it's right to make sure that you point out in everything that you do that what you're saying is backed up by academic research and rigor, that it isn't just some sort of random opinion you've plucked out of the air, because that does lend weight to what you're saying. But what you shouldn't do, and really I would say mustn't do, is go into long, complicated discussions about exactly why it's rigorous and how rigorous it is and what you've double-blinded in your tests and things like that, because policymakers, 9 times out of 10, either aren't interested or simply don't know enough about the detail to sort of decipher that in a reliable way. By all means, point them to the papers and the publications that back up what you're saying. But don't lead with it. But on the point of an individual, I mean, one of the reasons that that we exist as a centre is to help academics to connect with policymakers in Wales and vice versa. So we really are, our role is, and the other What Works network member organisations are similar, is to help academics to make that connection and policymakers to connect with academics. And by and large, we do that by going out and finding people, but we're very happy to have people find us as well. I will say as well that parliamentary committee evidence sessions are a great way to start to engage. So they may not invite you for a personal session, but generally they have open calls for evidence where you can submit your research to these committees, which will be cross-party. Cross-party committees don't directly inform government decisions, but do hold government to account, do scrutinise their decision-making and recommend policy initiatives off their own back, and they're a really useful thing to be getting involved with.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Stephany. So as I mentioned, it seems to be a good idea for a early career researcher, if he or she wants to be engaged in this area that we are discussing today, to join an organization. And you have, of course, very rightly pointed out the importance of the young academies. So if I were an early career researcher and was thinking about this, I might want to know, how difficult is it to become a member of one of the young academies? Is it very competitive? Is there a big chance of not being able to join it? What are you looking for when you are selecting people for the young academies? I think it might be helpful for people to hear a bit about that, Stephany.
Okay, so I don't represent one academy, but depending on the academies around Europe, you can find their website, and they're very clear with what they're looking for. Usually they will require academic excellence and then a commitment to have science for some impact and to have a mindset of transdisciplinarity. So that's something that you would expect. And now young academies usually elect around 10 members every year. So it is quite a small cohort, which means it would be very competitive. But I do want to point out, though, that which is why I mentioned that we're trying to increase the network of YASAs, because being in a young academy is one way to have access to science for policy, because you are ensuring the science quality, but it's not the only way. And I really do want to promote that it's not the only way to also qualify for being an excellent scientist. So I think having an attitude of wanting to look for fora where you can engage in this science for policy discussions would be really important as well. And for example, Katherine mentioned the Europaea network, which sounds really, really fascinating. So take a look at the UK Young Academy website, and then take a look at the Europaea website as well, because maybe you'll find that one of them will work for you. And the best thing overall is just to get exposure. So I think it's so important that you get involved in some network that will get you into talking with people that are not only in your field, that are already involved in science for policy, because that's how you start getting more impact.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's sort of worries some of us who are a bit older in the sense is that many of the young academies are quite small. So you actually represent a huge number of early career researchers, but the actual membership of the young academies is often, in many cases, quite small, and actually very often much smaller than the very well-established, so to speak, old academies, which inevitably, because you need a lot of experience and exposure before you are elected, for example, as a fellow of the Royal Society. But there is some kind of discrepancy, it seems to me, between the relatively small number of early career researchers who are in these organizations and the much larger ones that are in the older academies, which means that you actually have a larger percentage of older people who are engaged in these activities than the percentage of younger activities. So this is just to be a bit provocative. So, for example, does YASAS have a policy of wanting to expand?
Absolutely, and we are currently working on it. So we will have a General Assembly later this month where we will have our members vote whether we can officially welcome non-young academies associations or organizations into our network, because we do seek to support early careers, as many as early careers as we can. So this is definitely something that we are addressing.
So when we are on this question of numbers, maybe Katherine can also comment on the UPenn. I mean, how big is it in terms of the number of people who are engaged?
So I don't have the numbers for individuals, but it's over 110 institutions across the UK. That includes higher education institutions, universities, research centres, and I believe policy organisations as well. Individual membership, I think, varies across both researchers at all stages of their research career, so early career researchers all the way up, and professional service staff, knowledge mobilizers, knowledge brokers, such as roles like my own. UPenn, like I say, is a network and a forum. It has a number of sort of subcommittees varying across sort of thematics, but also areas of engagement. So, for example, there's an EDI subcommittee, which I think speaks to some of the points that Stephany made in her presentation, and provides opportunities for engagement. There's a conference coming up in June. There are a range of events throughout the year which are designed to support skills and experience building for the research community, and it provides a number of sort of written and other resources as well to help those wanting to get started in academic policy engagement. So I definitely recommend that the website's been put in the chat, checking the website and joining up as a member to access its resources.
So just to clarify, can anyone become a member of UPenn? How does that work? Yes,
membership is free. As far as I'm aware, anybody can become a member. There's a mailing list which will provide regular updates, but being a member will provide access to things like events, the conference, etc.
Okay. So another issue that has been raised by several of you is, of course, the question about the incentives for actually engaging in policy. And I think that is a key issue, isn't it? Because for many people, their own research, particularly for early career researchers, is obviously uppermost in their minds. You need to publish or perish, as we know, is the sort of watchword. And it seems that some of the requirements, in a sense, for engaging with policy work, I mean, I'm not disputing any of that. I think that's exactly right, what you have all pointed out. But it can seem as if it is sort of quite a lot of work that is involved in order to be involved in that. And clearly, if you involve a lot of your time in this, then there's time for other things. And so the question is, are there, in your view, and I address that to the whole panel, in your institutions and in your neighborhoods, do you feel that there are adequate incentives? And if not, what would you like in a concrete way to see being introduced in order to provide the kind of incentives that maybe could make more people willing to be engaged. Don't know who wants to go first, Stephany?
Yeah, so this is why I brought up the JRC tool for capacitation of skills. I think it'd be really important to see in SAPEA, for example, and in YASAS to have a clear idea of what skills doing science for policy can offer the early careers, and by having those skills, perhaps also working with what kind of impact you can have, then institutionally we can support or incentivize our early careers to engage in these activities, because we'll be very clear what the benefits are. So this is why I think really going through what it entails to do this type of work, because it's a lot of skills that you need. Being very clear with that will become more impactful, I think, of why it's important to do them.
Okay, so that's one very important aspect. So you're advocating that the main incentive, in a sense, would be that you simply learn more, you learn how to do things, and that is a skill that could be helpful for you in your career. So the other side of it is, of course, what institutions should be doing in order to recognize that people have done work of this type. And at the moment, I guess there is a feeling that the institutions are not actually paying a lot of attention to what people have done in that respect, and that they put all their emphasis on the academic publications. Maybe Jack has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I think from our perspective, we see one of the main incentives as being the opportunity to see your work reach a wider audience and sort of have an influence on decision making and policy in the wider world. I think for many people, particularly working in policy adjacent areas, that can be a reward in itself. Of course, as a centre, we also financially reward people for producing these things, which we find is sufficient incentive as well, but that's not always on the cards. But I think it is that ability to translate your research into something which is seen by and used by a wider audience than perhaps it would be if it stays within academic journals, can be something which motivates people. I know that there are lots of people out there who are motivated in that way. Is that institutionally recognised by universities? I mean, perhaps not. You know, we know that there are a lot of time pressures on academics. There are pressures to publish in peer-reviewed journals, which we don't do or offer as a rule. Our sort of reports are our reports. They're peer-reviewed, but freely published, not in a journal form. But we hope that as things evolve, and as perhaps there could be a shift away from a quantity view to a quality view of peer-reviewed publication, and to a more holistic understanding of what impact actually is, that these activities do become more appealing from a purely professional perspective, as well as from a sort of personal satisfaction perspective. So having that ability to do something like this and say, look, this is a great thing to put in my ref as a impact study, or as something that I've done which has reached a wider audience, and to be able to use that professionally as well as personally, I think could be a real incentive in the future.
Okay, Katherine.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on both Stephany and Jack's points there, because I think there are two sides to this. There is certainly the personal skills that you pick up, and what we've learned from engaging and providing opportunities for particularly career researchers to engage with policy, whether it's through participating in and hosting roundtables or undertaking policy secondments where you're embedded within a policy organization, is that it's the soft and transferable skills that you pick up through doing that will see you through your career, whether you stay in academia or you look to transition to a career into policy or another environment. So I think there's certainly the personal skills that you pick up are much easier to, I think, make a case for. The professional impact, it's very difficult to draw direct causality between your piece of research and a policy outcome. That's not an easy line to draw, as we've sort of stressed. The opportunities and the routes and the elements of policy engagement are very iterative, and it's a bit of a war of attrition to sort of keep getting your message out there. I think we are slowly seeing a move towards a broader concept of impact, both at the institutional level and I think at the research funding level, which I think is the critical third part to the picture here. I think institutions are gradually moving to include things like policy impacts within promotional framework, for example. That's a move that's being made at my institution, and I think it's being made more broadly across the piece. We are seeing the move in REF towards considering a broader concept of impact. I think we will see an increase in policy engagement as parts of impact REF impact case studies. I think including research culture and thinking about that is an interesting move when it comes to REF. And I think increasingly when you see calls being made through particularly UKRI research councils, so you look across the sort of multidisciplinary type calls that we're getting across research councils and centre calls, you'll see that policy engagement is a large area for that. So I think research funding is increasingly, I think, also considering policy impact as part of that broader concept of impact. But it remains difficult to like I say, to evidence that direct causality between your research and policy impact, and to provide the evidence in order to make that case for sort of professional benefit.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that perhaps there is room for improving things a bit, because after all, at the end of the day, I'm not discounting that there is a lot of idealism, particularly in the younger researcher group. But by and large, a lifelong experience has taught me that people work in their own interest. And maybe, I mean, for pure academic work, there are a lot of accolades, prizes, awards that you can get. They're not, doesn't seem to be kind of the same kind of incentives in policy work. Where are the prizes, awards, signposting, or particularly spectacular works that have been carried out in science policy advice? Maybe some of you in your various organizations should think about this, because we need to create maybe a bit more of a buzz around science advice. And if one were to say, well, there's a prize for having done a really spectacular work, then that could again be one of several elements that could be helpful. So I would be interested to hear whether any of you see that there could be some merit in thinking about this. Katherine?
I love the idea of a prize for policy engagement. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there are any out there. I think perhaps at this individual institutional level would be less effective than at perhaps something like a YASA level or you know, a sort of society type level. I think organizations like UPenn do a lot to promote and champion where there is examples of excellent policy engagement. I think if you check out the UPenn conference that's coming up in a few weeks' time, you'll see not only the opportunity to find out about how to do policy engagement, but where there has been great examples of that. And I think within institutions we do, you know, groups such as myself, not every university has a public policy function such as ours. They traditionally perhaps might have broader impact teams and impact engagement functions, but where we can, we do champion examples of where there have been excellent policy engagement, right through from here's a great example of somebody who's submitted a written submission to a select committee to here's a member of our staff who's been a chief scientific advisor. You know, for example, Patrick Vallance is a UCL member of staff. Alan Penn was the chief scientific advisor to Department for local community engagement. You know, so there's a range of scales, and I think where we can champion that's great. I love the idea of a prize. Maybe we'll all work together to get to that point.
Stephany?
Well, Katherine made a really good point with bringing up funding, and that's I think of course prizes, but also funding is such a big incentive. And when we see now that the European Commission is really looking for science for impact in their grant proposals, and they've introduced the narrative CV style where you're actually not just listing your achievements, but you can actually say how your science has been impacting. Then we see there, and together with the COARA, which is the research assessment reform, we see that there clearly is a movement to recognize and reward this type of science for impact activity. So definitely we are moving in that direction.
Okay, Wendy Sattler has sent in a comment and says that I think one of the ERC public engagement prizes is focused on the impact on policy. So maybe there is already something out there, but I guess there is still room for going quite a bit further. So I think, I mean, there is this dual track. On the one hand, policy engagement definitely will give you experiences that are valuable and also skills that are valuable, but the same is obviously the case for pure academic research. And the other side still probably needs a bit more development, both in terms of institutions recognizing that this is something really important for people to do, and possibly also from various, maybe also from some of the very grown up and well-established academies to kind of recognize what particularly younger people are doing, because there's a risk element. I mean, one thing that's actually a question to Stephany that some people may be a bit worried about. It's obviously clear that a young academy needs to have a turnover. And you mentioned that typically the membership is 5 years. And that's otherwise, of course, it wouldn't remain a young academy. On the other hand, as seen from an individual who puts in a lot of effort in those 5 years, it can also presumably be a bit disappointing that after 5 years you are sort of chalked out, and that's it. Have you thought about this particular problem and whether there is some kind of solution to that?
They have alumni networks, so you'll remain an alumni, and I think you will have benefited greatly in that. Networks are so important in career development and in getting action, because when you get minds that are equally excited to do things, that's when things get done. So they won't be active members, but they'll be alumni, and they'll keep that network together.
Okay, thank you. And Wendy Sattler has sent in another comment where she says there's a category called influence, media and policy. And she has given a link, and maybe Juliet can distribute that link so that everyone can see it. Well, we are coming to the end of our webinar. There are only 2 minutes left, so unless there is some very urgent. Oh, Katherine has her hand up. We still have two minutes.
Can I make one final comment, which relates to the category of influence? I think there's an important distinction that we make within UCL public policy between influencing and informing. That tends to be that at an institutional level, and when you're speaking on behalf of your institution, you most likely will be asked to inform, which is to provide the evidence and to provide the underpinning reasoning, but not necessarily go to the level of wanting to influence, i.e. to provide the recommendation to determine a policy direction. What you're doing is you're providing the evidence that says this is the evidence base that will help to make the informed policy decision. However, individuals, of course, are their own person and are entirely at liberty to want to influence and to stray more towards that sort of lobbying territory. But I think there's an important distinction there between what is to inform with evidence and what is to influence with perhaps more with opinion.
Okay, thank you. Stephany, just very briefly.
My closing remark, for early careers, join summer schools, join conferences or fora that will get you together with different stakeholders, because that's how you realize if this is something you like, and then you also get the skills. So, and also contact me if you want any more advice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it just remains for me to thank particularly the panel for their contributions and for the lively discussion. And I also have to pay tribute to Juliet and others at the Learner Society for Wales and in the Academia Europaea, who have worked very hard behind the scenes to make this event such a successful occasion. So thank you very much, and thank you to all those who still remain with us at this relatively late hour for a webinar. We still have more than 60 people out there, so I think that's not bad at all. So once more, thanks to Julia Davis and Alice Sattler for being there in the back room and constantly feeding us with important information, and to Barbara for her. And I think Barbara may have just a very quick comment at the very end.
Thank you so much, Ole. I just wanted to introduce myself as Program Manager for Research and Development at the Learner Society of Wales. We will send you more information about the opportunities that we have for early career researchers, but I just wanted to mention that we are delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with the Academia Europaea, and that the network has opportunities for ECRs to connect within, with ECRs across Wales, but also beyond, and that we actually engage with the knowledge exchange team at the Welsh Parliament, specifically to working into creating opportunities for researchers to collaborate with policymakers. So I hope you can look at our details in our website. We have a dedicated site for early career researchers. And then in June, we're going to have a colloquium, which is a one-day event aiming and inviting ECRs to engage with policy within Wales. So I think this is going to be a very exciting opportunity. If some of you can join us, just send me an email and follow us on X or Twitter, and we will be, willing to hear from you. And thank you so much, Ole, for chairing the webinar and for all the wonderful presentations.
Okay, thank you very much once more to everyone for being with us today. And I'll close the webinar now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.